The 911 call came in at 7:42 p.m., just as the Alabama sky was bleeding from orange into a deep, bruised purple. It was the kind of humid August evening in Birmingham where the air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of magnolias and imminent rain. The voice on the other end of the line was a man's, tight with a panic that sounded almost too perfect, too scripted. "My girlfriend, she fell," he stammered, his words tripping over each other. "She fell down the stairs. Oh God, there's so much blood. Please send someone. 112 Sweetwater Creek Lane." The address was in a transitional neighborhood, a pocket of the city where renovated craftsman bungalows with manicured lawns stood uneasily beside houses with peeling paint and sagging porches. It was a place of contrasts, of old money fading and new ambitions struggling to take root. The first on the scene were two patrolmen, Miller and Shaw, white officers who'd seen their share of domestic tragedies in this part of town. They found Khalil Jennings, a lean 31-year-old artist, shirtless and wearing only sweatpants, his face a mask of theatrical grief. At the bottom of a steep, polished wooden staircase lay the body of a woman. She was Jasmine Dubois, 45, a successful real estate broker from the moneyed suburbs of Atlanta. Even in death, she exuded an aura of power and expense. Her silk robe was rucked up around her thighs, revealing legs that spoke of gym memberships and discipline. Her head was twisted at an impossible angle against the newel post, a dark, sticky pool of blood haloing her styled hair on the pristine white floor tiles. It was a brutal, ugly punctuation mark at the end of a life that was clearly anything but. Miller and Shaw exchanged a look. "Another Saturday night," Miller muttered, his tone saturated with a weary cynicism. They took Khalil's statement, a rushed, breathless account of hearing a scream from the bathroom, of running out to find his beloved Jazz at the bottom of the stairs. They nodded, jotted down notes, and treated the scene with the perfunctory air of a foregone conclusion, a tragic accident, a case to be closed before the paperwork piled up. Detective Desmond Washington arrived 40 minutes later. At 52, Washington was a veteran of the Birmingham PD, a tall, broad-shouldered African-American man whose calm demeanor concealed a mind that missed nothing. He'd learned long ago that the most important clues weren't always in the evidence, but in the atmosphere, in the silent spaces between the official stories. As he ducked under the yellow tape, the first thing that struck him was the stillness. The house was too quiet, too orderly for the chaos of a sudden, violent death. The air was cold, conditioned, sterile. It didn't feel like a home shattered by grief. It felt like a stage after the final curtain had fallen. He greeted the patrolman with a curt nod, his eyes already scanning, absorbing. He saw the polarizing scene they saw, the beautiful dead woman and the distraught boyfriend. But he interpreted it through a different lens. He noted the living room, minimalist, clean, with expensive art on the walls. Then his eyes fell to the bottom of the stairs, to the victim. Washington walked a slow circle around Jasmine's body. The patrolman had accepted the fall narrative. Washington saw the unnatural straightness of her legs, the way her arms were flung out, not crumpled in a defensive posture. It looked less like a tumble and more like she'd been arranged. He let his gaze drift away from the body, sweeping the room. The living room was immaculate, save for 2 wine glasses and an open bottle of pricey Chardonnay on a glass coffee table. He walked towards a large, cream-colored sofa that sat against the far wall, at least 15 feet from the base of the staircase. Something glinted under the low-slung frame. He knelt, his knees cracking softly in the silence, and used his pen to slide the object out into the light. It was a single pearl earring, elegant and expensive, the kind that screwed on securely. It lay there, isolated and impossible. There was no conceivable way an earring, securely fastened to an earlobe, could have come loose, flown across the room, and landed perfectly under that sofa from a simple fall down the stairs. It was a small, silent testament, a tiny, polished lie in a room full of them. Detective Washington found Khalil Jennings in the kitchen, a cup of untouched water in front of him. Khalil looked up, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. He had the chiseled features and intense gaze of a man who was used to being looked at, a struggling artist who wore his struggle like a badge of honor. He was the very picture of devastation. But Washington, a connoisseur of human sorrow, real and feigned, felt a dissonant note. The grief felt performed. "Detective Washington?" he introduced himself, his voice low and even. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Jennings. I need to ask you a few questions." Khalil nodded, running a hand through his tightly coiled hair. Anything to help. I can't believe she's gone." His voice cracked on cue. He launched into his story, a more polished version of the one he'd given the patrolman. It was a narrative painted in broad, romantic strokes. Jasmine had driven in from Atlanta the day before. It was a whirlwind romance, a meeting of souls. They had a perfect evening, a perfect day exploring the city, and then this. "We came home, had a glass of wine," Khalil said, his eyes fixed on the table. "She went upstairs to shower. I was in the guest bathroom down the hall. I heard a scream and then a thud, the most god-awful sound." Washington let the silence hang in the air. "I noticed some scratches on the back of your hand, Mr. Jennings." Khalil's eyes darted to his own hands, as if he'd forgotten they were there. Fresh red lines raked across his knuckles. I tried to catch her," he stammered, a little too quickly. "When I found her, I tried to move her, to help her. I must have scraped it on the banister." The explanation was plausible, yet felt flimsy, an ad-libbed line in a well-rehearsed play. Washington filed it away. "You're an artist, I see," Washington said, gesturing to the sculptures and canvases that adorned the house. "A sculptor?" "Yes," Khalil said, a flicker of pride cutting through the grief. "I work with metal, mostly, some stone. May I see your studio?" A shadow crossed Khalil's face. The grief mask slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by something else. Defensiveness. It's a mess right now. I don't think it's relevant." "In an investigation like this, Mr. Jennings, everything is potentially relevant until it's not," Washington said calmly. Reluctantly, Khalil led him to a converted garage attached to the back of the house. The contrast with the main house was jarring. If the house was a carefully curated gallery of success, the studio was the chaotic, raw engine room. The air was thick with the metallic tang of welding and the chalky smell of clay dust. Tools were scattered everywhere. Unfinished metal sculptures, twisted and aggressive, stood like skeletal sentinels in the dim light. They were jagged, sharp, and unsettling. In the center of the room, a large block of marble sat half-carved, a pristine white island in a sea of gray dust and metal shavings. Washington's eyes scanned the chaos. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just feeling the space. He noted the heavy hammers, the sharp chisels, the welding torches. It was a room full of potential weapons. Khalil stood by the door, his arms crossed tightly, watching the detective with an unnerving intensity. He was no longer the grieving boyfriend. He was a guardian, a man protecting his territory. Washington felt a prickle on the back of his neck. This room, this chaotic sanctuary of creation, felt wrong. He had no evidence, no tangible reason for his suspicion, just a detective's gut feeling, honed by decades of wading through the darkest currents of human behavior. He was certain that an answer to this violent tragedy was hidden somewhere in this room, concealed beneath the dust and the artistic pretensions. The question was, what was it? The next morning, Detective Washington drove back to Sweetwater Creek Lane. The yellow tape was gone, but a psychic stain remained. He bypassed Khalil's house and went next door, to the home of Mrs. Henderson. She was a woman in her late 70s, with kind eyes and a garden full of prize-winning roses. Her front porch was a sanctuary of Southern charm, a stark contrast to the cold, modern facade of the house next door, where a woman had died. "I knew something was wrong," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she offered Washington a glass of sweet tea. "I was out here, tending to my petunias, like I do every evening." She had been a neighbor to Khalil Jennings for 3 years. She described him as quiet, polite, but distant. "An artist, you know," she said, as if that explained everything, always in his own world. But she knew Jasmine, too. She'd seen her arrive the day before, stepping out of a gleaming black Mercedes, looking, in Mrs. Henderson's words, like a queen visiting a very small country. "What did you hear yesterday evening, Mrs. Henderson?" Washington asked gently. "It started around 6, maybe a little after," she recalled, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Raised voices, an argument. I hear them fight sometimes, but this was different." "Different how?" "It was the laughter," she said, and a shiver ran down her spine despite the morning heat. It wasn't a happy laugh, Detective. It was cold, cruel. I heard his voice pleading, "Stop it, Jazz, just stop." But she just kept laughing. And then I heard her yell something. It was strange. What did she yell? Mrs. Henderson hesitated, as if embarrassed to repeat it. She shouted, "This is a joke. It's something a kid would play with." And then, what a colossal disappointment. The words, repeated in the gentle cadence of Mrs. Henderson's voice, sounded even more vicious. She was just cackling, this horrible, mocking sound. Then his voice, a roar this time. "Shut up!" Then, a thud, a heavy sound. Not the sound of a body falling downstairs, not right away. Just a single hard thud. Then a scream, a short one. And then, the final crash. Washington wrote it all down, his pen moving swiftly across the page. The kid's toy comment, the colossal disappointment, the cruel laughter. This wasn't an argument about a late dinner or a messy room. This was something deeply personal, something designed to wound. "Has he ever shown a temper before, Mrs. Henderson?" The old woman's eyes widened. She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Oh, yes, about 6 months ago. A delivery truck accidentally knocked over a small package of his. Just a small thing. But he came out of that house like a demon. I saw him from my kitchen window. He was screaming at the driver, his face all twisted up. When the truck drove off, he turned on his own car and just started kicking the tire, over and over, like a man possessed, grunting with every kick. It scared me, to be honest, to see so much rage over something so small." Washington thanked her for her time and for the tea. As he walked back to his car, the pieces were clicking into place, forming a dark and disturbing picture. He had the motive of humiliation, now confirmed by a witness. He had the thud that preceded the fall, suggesting a preliminary assault. And now he had a history. Khalil Jennings wasn't just a quiet artist. He was a man with a hidden well of rage, a man who could fly into a violent fury over the smallest slight. Washington now knew that what happened on that staircase wasn't an accident. It was an explosion. And he was beginning to suspect that Jasmine Dubois had deliberately lit the fuse. The Olive Branch County morgue was a place of cold, clinical efficiency, a world away from the humid, emotional chaos of a crime scene. Dr. Isabella Rossi, the county's chief medical examiner, was as precise and unsparing as the stainless steel instruments on her tray. She was a small, energetic woman whose sharp eyes missed nothing. "Detective Washington," she greeted him, not looking up from her microscope. "You were right to be suspicious." "Tell me what you have, Doctor," Washington said, his hands in his pockets. Dr. Rossi gestured to a large monitor displaying high-resolution photos of Jasmine Dubois' body. The images were stark and brutal. Official cause of death is a fracture of the C2 vertebra and massive cerebral hemorrhage. "Consistent with a fall down a flight of stairs," she began, her tone matter-of-fact. But that's where the consistency ends. She clicked to a new image, a close-up of Jasmine's wrist. Observe the contusions, 4 distinct oval bruises on the inner wrist, one larger one on the outer, classic grip marks. Someone, likely a right-handed male, grabbed her with significant force shortly before her death. Another click, a photo of Jasmine's shoulder. More bruising here. The pattern suggests she was shoved violently against a flat surface, like a wall. Another click, her face. And this pre-mortem abrasion on her left cheek, a slap, hard enough to break capillaries. This happened before the fall. Dr. Rossi turned from the screen to face him. "Detective, these are not the injuries of someone who simply tripped. These are the injuries of a struggle. She was grabbed, she was slapped, she was shoved. Then she went down those stairs." Washington nodded slowly. "It matches what the neighbor heard. A slap, a thud, then the fall." "Exactly," Dr. Rossi said. "But there's more. The thud Mrs. Henderson heard? I believe I know what caused it." She pointed to a photo of the crown of Jasmine's head, where her hair was matted with blood. "Hidden beneath the primary laceration from the fall, I found a smaller, distinct impact wound. It's a patterned injury, a blunt force trauma from an object with a defined edge. It wasn't enough to kill her, but it would have stunned her, likely causing her to lose her balance before she was pushed." The evidence was painting a clear timeline of violence. A grab, a slap, A blow to the head with an object, and then the final, fatal push. Khalil's story was not just a lie. It was a flimsy piece of fiction torn to shreds by the silent testimony of Jasmine's own body. "And one more thing," Dr. Rossi said, leaning back toward her microscope. "Something that doesn't fit at all. Under her fingernails, we found scrapings, her own skin, and DNA that we've matched to your suspect, Khalil Jennings." She was fighting back, scratching him. Those marks on his hands weren't from a banister. She paused, picking up a pair of tweezers. "But I also found this, embedded deep in the tissue scraped from under the nail of her right index finger." She carefully placed a minuscule object into a sterile evidence bag. It was a sliver of metal, no bigger than an eyelash, dark and glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. "It's some kind of alloy, ferrous, but with traces of copper and nickel. It's not from jewelry. It's not from a button or a zipper. It's industrial. The kind of thing you might find in a workshop." Washington stared at the tiny metal fragment. It was a microscopic piece of the puzzle, but it felt monumental. It was a physical link, a tangible piece of the crime that had been carried away on the victim's own hand. It was a direct dispatch from the chaotic, dust-filled studio he had visited the day before. The dead had spoken, and they had pointed him right back to the artist's den. Back in the sterile quiet of his office, Detective Washington stared at Jasmine Dubois' smartphone. The tech unit had bypassed the password. Now, the intimate hidden corners of a dead woman's life were laid bare on the glowing screen. It was a part of the job he always hated, a digital autopsy that felt like a profound violation. But it was necessary. He started with the messages to her best friend, a woman named Simone in Atlanta. The conversation log was a real-time map of the impending disaster. "Jasmine, 2 days ago. Heading to Birmingham tomorrow to see my little artist. Time to see if the starving artist cliché holds up in the bedroom. Simone. Girl, be safe and be nice. Jasmine. Nice is for deals that are closing. This is an audit. Hope he's not all talk and no action. I've invested too much time in this." The word invested snagged Washington's attention. It sounded more like business than romance. He kept scrolling. The messages from the night of her death started with excitement, but the tone shifted dramatically. "Jasmine, 6:52 p.m. Well, the audit is complete, and the company is bankrupt. Simone. OMG. That bad? Jasmine. Bad doesn't even begin to cover it. Simone. I swear to God, I have seen keychains bigger than this. It's like finding a single sad little shrimp in an entire ocean. God truly has a sense of humor." Washington leaned back, the crude, cruel words hanging in the air. This was the colossal disappointment Mrs. Henderson had heard. Jasmine hadn't just been disappointed, she'd been vicious. She'd taken photos, a gallery of humiliating close-ups of Khalil's genitalia, and sent them to Simone with laughing emojis. Jasmine, 7:15 p.m. He's sulking in the bathroom now. So sensitive. I told him not to worry. I'm sure it has a great personality. LMAO. The timeline was becoming terrifyingly clear. Her mockery, his fury. But as Washington scrolled to the final messages, the narrative took another sharp, unexpected turn. Simone, 7:31 p.m. Jazz, you are savage. You're going to break that poor boy. Jasmine, 7:34 p.m. Please, he's had it coming. You know that money I told you about? The investment in his art? It's all a scam. The gallery show he's been promising? It doesn't exist. I called the gallery owner this afternoon. Washington sat bolt upright. This wasn't just about sexual humiliation anymore. This was about money, a scam. Simone, 7:36 p.m. What? You're kidding me. All that money? The final message from Jasmine Dubois was sent at 7:38 p.m., just 4 minutes before the 911 call was placed. It was unfinished, a sentence cut short by violence. Jasmine, 7:38 p.m. He's not just small, he's a pathological liar about everything. I just found out the truth about his sculptures. The ones he sold last year, he didn't even make them. He's a fraud. I'm about to confront him and get my money bae. The message ended there. Get my money back. The cursor on the screen blinked, a tiny rhythmic pulse marking the exact moment a digital conversation had been silenced by a real-world explosion of rage. Jasmine hadn't just discovered a disappointing lover, she'd uncovered a fraudulent artist. She had threatened to expose him, to ruin not just his ego, but his entire fabricated career. Washington stared at the screen, the pieces crashing together. The motive wasn't just a bruised ego anymore. It was desperation. The desperation of a con man whose entire world was about to be burned to the ground by the woman he had failed in every conceivable way. To understand the lie, Washington needed to talk to the person who helped sell it. That led him to Leo Maxwell, Khalil Jennings's longtime friend and unofficial art agent. Washington found him at a chic, overpriced coffee shop downtown, a place that felt a million miles away from the dusty chaos of Khalil's studio. Leo was slick, well-dressed, and radiated an aura of nervous energy. "I can't believe this is happening," Leo said, stirring a cube of brown sugar into his espresso. "Khalil wouldn't hurt a fly." "People say that a lot," Washington replied dryly, "and it's rarely true. I need you to tell me about his relationship with Jasmine Dubois." Leo's story started out sounding like a fairy tale. Khalil, the brilliant but undiscovered artist. Jasmine, the wealthy, sophisticated patron who saw his genius. "She was his muse, his sponsor," Leo said, his words sounding rehearsed. "She believed in him." "She invested in him," Washington corrected. "Let's talk about that investment. How much?" Leo shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Jasmine? She was very generous. She was helping him prepare for his upcoming solo exhibition. A very prestigious gallery." "I know all about the exhibition that doesn't exist, Leo," Washington said, his voice dropping an octave. "I also know about the fraud, the sculptures he claimed he made, the ones he sold last year." The color drained from Leo Maxwell's face. His carefully constructed composure crumbled. He looked around the coffee shop, then leaned in, his voice a panicked whisper. He was desperate, okay? He hadn't sold a piece in almost 2 years. He was about to be evicted. Then these opportunities came up. To acquire some pieces from a sculptor in Eastern Europe. Cheap. We rebranded them, said they were his early work. It was a classic con. Buy low, create a fake backstory, and sell high to unsuspecting buyers. "And Jasmine found out," Washington stated. Leo nodded, looking miserable. "She was smarter than we gave her credit for. She started asking questions, doing her own research. She called me yesterday afternoon, furious, said she knew everything." "Let's go back to her investment," Washington pressed. "The generous one. How much money are we talking about, Leo?" Leo stared into his coffee cup, as if the answer was floating in the dark liquid. He finally looked up, his eyes full of a mixture of fear and resignation. $50,000, he said, the number landing on the table with a heavy thud. She gave it to him a month ago, a seed grant for materials and studio costs for the big show. He'd already spent most of it paying off debts. $50,000, a sum large enough to make someone desperate, a sum large enough to kill for. "She was coming to get it back, wasn't she?" Washington asked. "She told me on the phone," Leo confessed, his voice barely audible. "She said, 'I'm getting every last cent back tonight, or I'm going to burn his entire world to the ground. He'll be a laughingstock in more ways than one.' She was on a warpath, Detective. I tried to call Khalil to warn him, but he didn't pick up. I had no idea she was going to—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Washington sat back. The picture was now complete, a triptych of motive. First, the deep, festering wound of sexual humiliation. Second, the cold, hard desperation of financial ruin. And third, the imminent threat of total public exposure as a fraud. Jasmine Dubois hadn't just lit a fuse. She had handed a desperate man a bomb and dared him to let it explode. And Leo Maxwell, the loyal friend, had stood by and watched, complicit in the lie that had ultimately cost a woman her life. The news that the Birmingham PD was investigating Jasmine Dubois' death as a homicide, and not an accident, brought a storm down from Atlanta. Jasmine's family, old money, powerful, and accustomed to getting their way, descended on the city with a high-priced lawyer in tow. Their arrival shifted the entire dynamic of the case. The meeting took place in the police chief's office. The air was thick with tension. On one side sat the Dubois family and their lawyer, radiating an icy, privileged anger. On the other sat Chief Miller, Detective Washington, and an assistant DA. My sister was murdered in your city, Chief. Jasmine's older brother, a man with the soft hands and hard eyes of a corporate raider, said. And what we're seeing is a slow, almost indifferent investigation. We have to wonder if the response would be the same if the victim wasn't a successful black woman and the suspect wasn't a local boy. The accusation of racism, inverted and aimed at the department, hung in the air. It was a calculated move, designed to apply pressure. Washington remained silent, his face an unreadable mask, but he felt a familiar burn of frustration. The Dubois family saw the world in black and white, privilege and disadvantage, power and powerlessness. They couldn't conceive that the system they were accusing of bias was the same one he had fought his entire career to navigate. The pressure wasn't just external. Within the department, Washington felt the subtle pushback. Some of his white colleagues, the same ones who'd initially dismissed the case, now saw it as a political minefield. "Look, Des," one of them told him by the coffee machine, "you've got a confession waiting to happen. He was provoked. She humiliated him. Let's offer him manslaughter too. He takes a plea, and we all sidestep a messy, racially charged trial that nobody wants." It was the path of least resistance, a way to appease the powerful family from out of town while avoiding a public spectacle. But for Washington, it wasn't about politics or optics. It was about the truth in all its ugly complexity. It was about the thud before the fall, the metal sliver under the nail, the calculated lies. This wasn't a simple crime of passion, it was more. During a break in the tense meeting, the Dubois family's lawyer pulled Washington aside. "My clients believe the motive was robbery," he said, handing Washington a file. "They don't buy the lover's quarrel narrative." Washington opened the file. Inside was a bank statement. It showed a cash withdrawal made by Jasmine Dubois from her personal account the day before she drove to Birmingham. The amount made Washington's breath catch in his throat. $50,000 in cash. She was a real estate broker, detective, the lawyer explained. She was in the middle of a cash-only deal for an investment property. She often carried large sums. "We believe your suspect found out, killed her for the money, and is now trying to hide behind a story of wounded pride." The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. The $50,000 wasn't just a loan. It was a tangible physical object, a bag full of cash, and it was missing. Suddenly, the case had a new, much cleaner motive: armed robbery culminating in murder. It was simpler, less messy, and far more likely to secure a first-degree murder conviction than a convoluted story about sexual humiliation and artistic fraud. The Dubois family wanted a monster, and a cold-blooded thief was a much more palatable monster than a pathetic, insecure man. Washington stared at the bank statement. The missing money changed everything. It explained a potential robbery, but it didn't explain the personal, vicious nature of the fight Mrs. Henderson had overheard. It didn't explain the taunts about kids' toys. He was now facing two powerful, competing narratives. Was Khalil a humiliated lover who snapped, or a calculating killer who murdered for cash? And where in God's name was that $50,000? The competing narratives of the case, the crime of passion versus the murder for profit, were at war in Desmond Washington's mind. He needed to get away from the noise, from the lawyers and the office politics, and back to the source. He drove back to Sweetwater Creek Lane and stood in front of Khalil Jennings's house. It was sealed, a silent monument to the violence that had erupted within its walls. Washington walked the perimeter, his mind replaying every piece of evidence. The cruel laughter, the taunts, the thud, the fall, the metal sliver, the missing $50,000 in cash. Robbery was a clean motive, but it felt wrong. The crime felt too personal, too rage-filled. A simple mugging doesn't usually start with an argument about sexual performance. He believed the rage was real, but the missing money was also real. The two facts felt like repelling magnets. He stood in the backyard, staring at the chaotic artist's studio, and then he looked beyond it, to the garden, if you could call it that. It was a half-acre of overgrown, untamed Alabama wilderness. Thick patches of kudzu wrestled with thorny bushes and tall weeds. It was a perfect place to hide something: a bag of money, a murder weapon. His mind went back to Dr. Rossi's report. A distinct impact wound on Jasmine's head, caused by a blunt object with a defined edge. The thud Mrs. Henderson heard. He envisioned the scene, the argument escalating on the second-floor landing, Jasmine's vicious words raining down on Khalil. He snaps. He doesn't just push her, he hits her first. With what? Something from his pocket? Something he grabbed? Washington walked over to the studio and peered through a grimy window. He saw the hammers, the chisels, the jagged metal sculptures. The metal sliver under Jasmine's fingernail came from this room. He was sure of it. What if the murder weapon was one of his own creations? A small, heavy piece of art. He could have struck her with it then, in the ensuing panic and struggle, pushed her down the stairs. After calling 911, in the 8 minutes before the first patrol car arrived, he would have had just enough time to run out the back into the overgrown garden and bury the evidence, the weapon and the bag of cash. It was a theory, but it was the only one that tied everything together: the rage, the initial blow, the missing evidence, and the convenient hiding spot. The house and the studio had been searched, but the yard had only been given a cursory look. It was too big, too dense. A human search team could spend a week out there and find nothing. They needed a different kind of investigator. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the department's K-9 unit. "Sergeant Miller, it's Detective Washington," he said. "I'm at 112 Sweetwater Creek Lane. I need you and your best search dog out here. The works. Cadaver, evidence, the whole 9 yards. There was a pause on the other end. "You think you're going to find something out there, Dez?" "I think the truth of this case isn't in the house," Washington replied, his eyes fixed on the dark, tangled woods at the edge of the property. "I think it's buried out there in the dirt. Get Shadow ready. We're going digging." An hour later, the quiet street was once again alive with official activity. The K-9 unit arrived, and with it came Shadow, a magnificent German shepherd whose focused, intelligent eyes seemed to understand the gravity of his work. His handler, Sergeant Miller, gave him the command, and the dog immediately went to work, his nose to the ground, his entire body a finely tuned instrument of detection. Washington stood back with a small team of officers, watching the methodical process. It was a fascinating, primal dance. Shadow moved with a purpose that was almost unnerving, ignoring the mundane sense of the neighborhood. The squirrels, the neighbor's cat, the scent of Mrs. Henderson's roses. He was on a mission, searching for the smells of death, decay, and human desperation. He made a pass through the house first, confirming the known locations of blood, and confirming that there were no other bodies. Then, Sergeant Miller led him to the back door of the studio. Shadow's demeanor changed instantly. His tail stiffened, his sniffing became more frantic. He caught the scent. He bolted out the back door and into the overgrown garden, ignoring the cleared pathways. He plunged directly into the thickest, most tangled part of the yard, a section near the back fence choked with weeds and discarded scraps of metal from Khalil's work. The officers followed, pushing through thorny branches and swatting at insects. For 20 minutes, the only sounds were the panting of the dog and the rustle of undergrowth. Washington felt a familiar knot of anticipation tighten in his stomach. He had staked a significant amount of department resources, not to mention his own credibility, on this hunch. If they found nothing, the robbery theory would gain more traction, and the pressure to accept a plea bargain for a lesser charge would intensify. Suddenly, Shadow stopped. He was near an old, half-rotted oak tree. He began to whine, a low, keening sound. He circled the spot once, twice, and then began to dig, his powerful front paws sending dirt and dry leaves flying. "He's on to something," Miller shouted. The officers rushed forward with shovels. As Shadow continued to bark and claw at the ground, they began to dig. Less than a foot down, a shovel struck something that wasn't a rock. It was soft. An officer knelt and cleared the dirt away with his hands. It was a canvas satchel, the kind artists use to carry supplies. It was heavy. Washington's heart hammered against his ribs. The money. An officer carefully lifted the bag from its shallow grave and placed it on a tarp. The air was thick with anticipation as he unzipped it. But inside, there was no cash. There were no stacks of $100 bills. Instead, nestled in the dirt-stained canvas, was a single object, a small, brutalist sculpture made of twisted dark metal. It was about the size of a man's fist, heavy and dense, with sharp, defined edges. And on one of those sharp edges, Washington could see it clearly, a few strands of hair and a dark flaking stain that could only be dried blood. It was the murder weapon, the object that made the thud, the source of the metal sliver under Jasmine's fingernail. They had found it. It was a monumental victory, a critical piece of the puzzle locked into place. But as the forensics team carefully bagged the evidence, a cold, unsettling feeling washed over Washington. They had the weapon. But the money, the $50,000 that Jasmine's family was so certain she had, was still missing. They had proven one theory right, but in doing so, had made the other one even more mysterious. Where was the cash? Finding the weapon should have simplified things, but instead, it had only deepened the remaining crucial question. The interrogation room was cold and gray, designed to strip away all comfort and pretense. Khalil Jennings sat at the metal table, his lawyer beside him, looking thinner and more haggard than before. He had been clinging to his story of a tragic accident, a story his lawyer clearly believed was his only shield. Detective Washington entered the room and sat down opposite him. He said nothing. He simply placed a large, clear evidence bag on the table between them. Inside, cleaned and tagged, was the small, brutalist metal sculpture. Khalil's eyes locked onto the object, and for the first time since his arrest, the mask of the grieving artist, of the victim of circumstance, completely shattered. A wave of pure animal panic washed over his face. He visibly shrank in his chair. "We found it, Khalil," Washington said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We found it in your garden." Dr. Rossi matched the shape to the impact wound on Jasmine's head. "We found her hair and her blood on it, and the metal alloy matches the sliver we found under her fingernail when she scratched you, fighting back." He let the words hang in the suffocating silence. He then laid out the rest of it, piece by damning piece. Mrs. Henderson's testimony about the argument, the cruel laughter, the thud, the text messages from Jasmine's phone, the vicious mockery, the photos, the story of the fraudulent art career from his friend, Leo. Khalil's lawyer looked stunned, his face pale. He was hearing the true depth of his client's deception for the first time. He leaned over and whispered frantically to Khalil, but Khalil wasn't listening. His gaze was still fixed on the sculpture in the bag, his own creation, now the instrument of his downfall. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," Khalil finally whispered, his voice cracking. Tears began to stream down his face, but these were not the performative tears of the first night. These were the hot, ragged tears of a man whose lies had finally collapsed on top of him. "Tell me what happened, Khalil," Washington urged, his voice softening slightly. "Tell me the truth." And the truth came pouring out, a torrent of humiliation, rage, and self-pity. He recounted Jasmine's laughter, how it had echoed in the quiet house, chipping away at his soul. "She called me pathetic, a little boy with a little toy," he sobbed. "She took pictures, said she was going to send them to all her friends, make me a joke." He described the confrontation at the top of the stairs. He'd had the small sculpture in his pocket. He'd been tinkering with it in his studio earlier. "I begged her to stop, to give me the phone. We struggled. I just wanted to make her shut up. I didn't even think. I had the sculpture in my hand, and I hit her, just once, on the head." He described the look of shock on her face, the way she staggered back. She screamed, and in that second all I could think was that she was going to ruin me. She was going to tell everyone everything, the art, the everything. I pushed her. I pushed her so hard. He covered his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean to kill her. I just wanted the laughing to stop." Washington let him cry for a moment before asking the final, critical question. "And the money, Khalil? The $50,000 in cash she had with her. Where is it?" Khalil looked up, his face a mess of tears and confusion. Then a strange, bitter smile twisted his lips. It was the most genuine expression Washington had seen on his face. "Money?" he scoffed, a single harsh laugh escaping his throat. "There was no money, detective. There was never any $50,000 in cash." "Her family has a bank statement," Washington pressed. "She withdrew it." "Of course she did," Khalil said, his voice rising with a new, hysterical energy. "She withdrew it to show me the statement, to hold it over my head. It was all part of the torture. She told me she had the cash in her car, and that if I didn't grovel and beg, she'd walk out with it and call the police about the fraud. But it was a bluff. A final, cruel little game to watch me squirm. The money was never in the house. She probably put it back in the bank the next morning. There was no money to steal. The confession hung in the air, more shocking than the admission of murder. Jasmine Dubois' final act had been one of supreme psychological cruelty. She had built an entire narrative of a missing bag of cash just to maximize her power over him, to ensure his complete and utter humiliation. The robbery motive, the foundation of her family's outrage, and the prosecution's strongest potential charge was a ghost. A lie. It was a lie that had gotten her killed. The trial of Khalil Jennings was a somber affair. Without the robbery motive, the prosecution's case for first-degree murder was significantly weakened. They were left with the messy, human tragedy of it all. The defense attorney, now fully aware of the facts, argued passionately that his client had been subjected to extreme emotional disturbance. He painted a vivid picture of Jasmine Dubois as a psychologically abusive and manipulative tormentor who had systematically dismantled a fragile man's psyche until he inevitably snapped. The prosecution countered, arguing that no amount of verbal taunting or humiliation could ever justify the act of bludgeoning a woman with a metal sculpture and pushing her down a flight of stairs. They presented Khalil as a man with a history of rage and a pattern of blaming women for his own deep-seated insecurities and failures. In the end, the jury struggled, torn between the brutality of the act and the undeniable cruelty of the provocation. They found Khalil Jennings guilty, not of murder in the first or second degree, but of manslaughter in the first degree. He was sentenced to 20 years in a state penitentiary. Jasmine's family left the courtroom in a state of quiet fury, feeling that the justice system had somehow blamed the victim for her own murder. To them, the nuances of Khalil's emotional state were irrelevant. Their brilliant, powerful Jasmine was gone, and the man who took her life would one day walk free. After the verdict, Detective Desmond Washington stood on the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun warming his face. He felt no sense of victory, only a profound and weary sadness. He had found the truth, unraveled the lies, and delivered the killer to the courts. But the justice that was served felt hollow, an imperfect solution to an irredeemably broken situation. He thought about the two people at the center of the storm. Khalil, a man so terrified of being seen as small that he committed an act of monstrous violence, forever defining himself not by his art, but by his rage. And Jasmine, a woman so accustomed to wielding power that she couldn't see the difference between breaking a business deal and breaking a man's spirit. She had used her words as weapons, sharpening them with cruelty, and had failed to realize that a cornered, wounded animal is the most dangerous kind. The case of the crack in Sweetwater Creek was closed, but for Washington, it served as a dark and enduring lesson. It was a testament to the terrifying power of secrets and shame, and a reminder that the most dangerous wounds are often the ones no one can see. In the war of egos, there are no true winners. There are only victims of their own pride and the cruelty of others, leaving behind a wake of tragedy that no court verdict could ever truly set right. The world wasn't black and white, he knew. It was infinite, overlapping shades of gray, and sometimes justice was just the saddest shade of them all.